Lest we forget. The ghost in the machine. I must have been 7. My old man had parts of the engine laid out in front of the fire on an old towel. He was oiling, polishing and sanding. The wireless was playing popular ditties. It had been snowing all week. My sister and I were playing dominoes. My mother was in the kitchen making up the wet dough for potato cakes, which she would cook in a frying pan on the fire. With a grunt of satisfaction, Dad looked at the neat collection of cylinder head, valves and pistons, glinting in the flickering reflections of the flames. "I'll put it together again in the morning," he said to no one in particular. Tomorrow was a Sunday. The Royal Enfield was his obsession. It reminded him of one of the so-called fleas, parachuted from gliders into Germany towards the end of the Second World War. A lightweight Royal Enfield saved my father's life. Wounded and left behind in woods in Normandy, the rest of the platoon having been killed or retreated, the bike had floated down through the night sky like a gigantic dandelion seed head and ended up hanging just inches above the ground, the chute caught in the branches of the tree under which he was hiding. He cut loose the lines, eased it down, and mounted it despite the shrapnel in his leg wound. The bike roared into defiant life and took him in a great curve, his body flat along the fuel tank, through a gap in the enemy's lines. He said he had no idea where he was going, except away from the incessant flashes and blasts of German guns. It carried him to safety. That bike, he often said, had been created with a living spirit inside it. He was a bit of a Shintoist, my dad, though he wouldn't have known the name for it. And now here I was, aged 70, taking the tarpaulin off the flea's bigger brother in my garage, where it had been stored since he died. I just hadn't been able to let it go. Sheer sentimentality. It was still standing proud on its kickstand, its green paint dull and dusty, its hand grips decomposing. I laid a palm on its leather seat and was sure I felt it quiver with pleasure, like my dog did when I touched him while sleeping. I remember Dad telling me he'd bought it at an army surplus auction after the war. He'd seen its picture in an ad in a paper. Although it wasn't like the actual bike that had borne him to freedom and saved him, it was much bigger. But it was from the same company and the same age. He wanted to restore it, to give it a big thank you, as though to his saviour lightweight version. Now I, just retired from medicine, felt something similar. I wanted to help it come back to life again, to thank it. After all, it had lifted post-war PTSD from his shoulders, became his chariot of fire, and carried him on long solo journeys where his dreadful memories would be plucked away from him as they raced together through all the elements. He swore that he never used maps, but let the Enfield take him, like a wild steed, wherever it wanted, in great circles, always returning to a heart-warming homecoming. Even in the 21st century, 80 years after it was born in a Redditch workshop in Worcestershire in 1943, there were small indie workshops still making replica parts for it. Like a living creature, it had its equivalent of lungs, circulation, flesh and bone, despite having 100,000 miles on the clock. Owing to the skill of an expert young biker friend, trips to far-off salvage yards, some online buying and plenty of sweat, it looked close to its original pristine beauty. Its black classic plate read LEO 333. If you research it, 333 in numerology means the protected one. This, together with the astrological sign Leo, made for an unfathomably mystical number plate. Dad called the bike the Lion. And the Lion it became for me too. The first time I rode it just a couple of miles to get the feel of it, it seemed to pull my body against it in a warm, oiled metal, fuel-intoxicating embrace. I sensed its delight at companionship after its solitary years of confinement. When I pulled up again in the yard, Mahendra, my 30-year-old Hindu mechanic friend, grinned as I pushed up my goggles. "Joshua, you look made for each other," he said. That's what it felt like. "They're wonderful beasts. We have Royal Enfields all over India. We got a license to build them after the war. I've seen whole families balanced on a bike and sidecar, moving house." Mahendra and I made regular weekend trips around the country, staying in pubs, camping, parking in beauty spots to take in the views. We topped mountains and hugged coastlines, riding along lanes, side roads and barely passable footpaths. I discovered, riding the Lion, an opening up of my younger self, a reawakened freedom I never knew had become shut down. I persuaded Mahendra that we should take a trip to Normandy and visit the Second World War graves. I promised my dad I'd do it one day on his behalf. He lost many comrades in the war. It turned out to be very sobering. The vast, orderly lines of crosses, somehow at odds with the unmapped, chaotic, hostile places of death of their inhabitants, and so many without names. As we started to prepare for our return, leaving the last burial site on our list, we saw a power glider arcing across the sky. The broken sun, reflected off a camera its rider was pointing across the vistas of the dead. A wind was rising, the clouds were scudding, and, as if we had a mutual premonition, our eyes glued to the sudden difficulties it was experiencing. Its engine had begun misfiring. Tossing about in the air currents, it began to lose weight with its rider trying to guide it towards a safe landing. We were astride our bikes by then. Suddenly, I've no idea how, because it was not intentional on my part, the Royal Enfield came to life underneath me. It set off, with Mahendra following, in the direction of the glider's likely crash site. There was suddenly no path to follow, yet the bike leapt and twisted over the thick grass and heather terrain. Mahendra couldn't follow. The Enfield seemed possessed. I hung on and hoped. The glider came down in trees. We arrived shortly after. I found the rider hanging crazily from her harness among the branches. I took her weight and helped her release herself and sink to the ground. She'd broken a leg. I phoned for help, giving the location. She was able to tell me through the pain that her grandfather had fought here during the Second World War, but he had not survived. She was making a personal film for her family, commemorating his life. Ambulance men and women arrived an hour later with a stretcher. We exchanged addresses and she was carried off, holding her camera to her chest. I took a last look at the mangled glider and was turning away when something out of place caught my gaze. I stepped back towards the wreckage hanging there. Among it were lengths of rotten parachute webbing and torn strips of fabric. I looked across at the Lion, and, I swear, as its engine cooled, it gave off a hissing sound, much like a sigh. That was Lest We Forget, The Ghost in the Machine. I hope you enjoyed it. The story had two inspirations. The first is my memory of my father maintaining his motorcycle in front of the fire in the early 1950s. The second is of being taken for rides by a friend when we were at college on his Royal Enfield. There is a story on this channel about an out-of-the-body experience this same friend had by the River Wear in County Durham. It is entitled The Wasp's Nest. Time Stings. If you haven't done so already, please click the subscribe button and you'll be notified when more stories emerge from my fevered brain. Meanwhile, you might like to read as well as listen to my work. And you can do that by going to www.jacksanger.com. And there you can download for free, or make a donation if you wish, to novels, plays and short stories, poetry and some Zen non-fiction. Meanwhile, I wish you well. Go in peace. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.